A refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London, mourns a young victim of Germany's air raids on London. A refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London, mourns a young victim of Germany's air raids on London during World War II. One of Dylan Thomas's best-known war poems, its Refusal, is laced with irony. The speaker resists writing a conventional elegy, yet captures the tragedy of the girl's death in soaring, intense language. Ultimately, the speaker links her particular death to the larger tragedy of mankind, including human mortality and the fragility of childhood innocence. The poem was first published in Horizon magazine in 1945 and collected in Thomas's Deaths and Entrances 1946. Summary. Not until the end of the world, when the darkness that creates and destroys all people, animals, and plants silently brings forth the last dawn, and the sea that lunges like a harnessed animal falls still, and I'm about to die and return to the sacred earth, including its water, crops, etc., will I utter the smallest sound of prayer, or cry into the smallest fold of a funeral suit, to grieve this child's extraordinary death by fire. I won't defile the immense human tragedy of her death by preaching some serious moral lesson. Nor will I desecrate the sanctity of life by writing yet another tribute to lost childhood innocence. This London girl is now buried with our oldest ancestors. She's covered in long worms and the timeless soil of Mother Earth, hidden underground beside the flowing Thames River, which does not grieve. The first death one experiences, or the world's first death, is final and encompasses all others. The tragedy of a child's death. A refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London, is an unusual kind of elegy. Rather than grieve its subject, it pointedly avoids grieving. The poem's speaker refuses to mourn a young victim of a World War II air raid until the world ends or until the hour of his own death. The speaker isn't unmoved by the girl's death. Instead, he holds back deep emotion as a gesture of respect, signaling that none of the conventional ways of mourning could be adequate in the face such a profound loss. The death in A Refusal to Mourn is tragic not only because it's violent and senseless but because it's a child's death. The poem implies that childhood innocence is precious and its loss terribly poignant. The speaker describes the tragedy itself as the majesty and burning of the child's death, and as the mankind of her going. Far from minimizing the death, these phrases portray it as something stunning and immense, as if the girl were a martyr. The word, majesty, accords the girl dignity even in her victimhood. In calling her, London's daughter, the speaker also conveys a parental or protective feeling toward the girl. Thus, the speaker's refusal to mourn is really an attempt to honor the tragedy, or not dishonor it with a trite, conventional response. That is, this is really a refusal of shallow or inadequate mourning. The speaker suggests that even to cry, "Sow my salt seed," or speak in hushed tones, "Let pray the shadow of a sound," would be inappropriate to the scale of this horror. And turning it into moralistic or sentimental writing would be even worse. Using the girl's death as an opportunity to pronounce a grave truth, that is, a serious moral lesson, would be like murdering her all over again. Using it to fuel an elegy of innocence and youth would be like blasphemy, that is, sacrilege. Indeed, the speaker treats this subject as so sensitive that it's almost sacred. He views the child's going as a blow to all mankind, or as tragically representative of the human experience, so he won't blaspheme it with a solemn, pretentious elegy. He doesn't even dare to cry, "Sow my salt seed," as if he doesn't have the right to. In short, the speaker is deeply affected by the girl's death, and by the destruction of innocence. He's not refusing to mourn it so much as refusing to sentimentalize or exploit it. The natural cycle of life and death. The speaker's refusal to mourn the child is partly an attempt to emulate the unmourning quality of nature. Despite the horror of the event, the speaker recognizes that death is universal. Even the most shocking death is part of a natural cycle, the poem implies, whereby the living return to nature and join the dead who came before them. Indeed, the speaker acknowledges that he is part of that process. He, too, is vulnerable and mortal. In struggling to remain stoic, the speaker is also trying to keep this tragedy in perspective, to understand it in the context of a natural and generational cycle. In describing the child as buried by the unmourning water of the Thames River, the speaker suggests that nature joins him, or vice versa, in refusing to mourn the tragedy. Even a senseless death, the poem implies, is part of the natural flow of things, a consequence of humanity's shared mortality. The phrase, the mankind of her going, evokes the same idea, that death is part of the collective human experience. The speaker also describes this lost daughter as buried among the dark veins of her mother, a phrase that invokes both Mother Earth and the girl's human family. Again, death is imagined as part of nature and the cycle of generations. The soil she's buried in is, beyond age, a reminder that she has now left or transcended youth. Death unites the young and old of all times and places. The speaker recognizes that this life and death cycle includes himself as well as the rest of humankind. He acknowledges that he, too, must, someday die and rejoin nature, enter again the water bead and the synagogue of the ear of corn. For now, the child has experienced a transformation the speaker can't fully understand, but he knows he will understand it eventually, as will every living creature. The poem ends by claiming, after the first death, there is no other. This ambiguous phrase echoes an earlier one, deep with the first dead lies London's daughter. The first death, then, might mean the first significant loss in one's own life, or it might mean the first human or mortal ever to die. Either way, the ending seems intended to justify the speaker's refusal to mourn. It implies that all deaths are tragic and inevitable, so the first grief encompasses every grief after. As soon as we mourn one person, we mourn all, including ourselves. Where this theme appears in the poem. Never until the last light breaking. The poem begins with an intense rush of language, one that doesn't stop or even pause until the end of line 13. These opening lines are heavily enjambed and contain no caesuras, so they seem to pour out in a surge of emotion. What kind of emotion? The title frames the poem as an adamant refusal. A child has died by fire, and the speaker is refusing to mourn the loss. Already, this conceit is surprising and unsettling. Who wouldn't grieve the death of a child? Is the speaker completely heartless? To begin answering these questions, it's necessary to understand the historical context conveyed by the title. The poem was first published in the UK toward the end of World War II, 1939-1945. At that time, a death by fire in London would have implied a death by firebombing, since Nazi Germany had heavily bombed London during the war. As such, the poet is responding to what were then recent events, and attempting to process a single loss within a broader national tragedy. The child doesn't seem to be someone the speaker knew, but rather someone he's learned about in the news. Again, however, despite his stated refusal, these opening lines sound impassioned. Their vivid imagery and dramatic metaphors conjure up an apocalyptic scenario. Never until the mankind making. Bird, beast and flower. Fathering in all humbling darkness. Tells with silence the last light breaking. In other words, the speaker will keep up the refusal in the title until the end of the world, until the darkness that creates and destroys Father S and humble S all creatures brings forth the final, eerily quiet dawn tells with silence the last light breaking. This doesn't sound like the kind of thing people say when they're emotionless. Instead, the speaker seems to be stoically, and just barely, holding back a flood of grief. Indeed, the death of this single child has affected him so much that he's imagining a biblical-sounding apocalypse. Perhaps her death, and the war surrounding it, feels like an omen of doom. Water and corn. The water bead and ear of corn in lines 7 to 9 are synecdoches for water and land vegetation in general, or nature as a whole. There's also plenty of traditional symbolism attached to both. For example, water is associated with cleanliness, purity, and holiness, e.g., via baptism. Corn is a staple food associated with human and animal sustenance in general. The speaker builds on this symbolism in imagining that, when he dies, his body will go back to the water and corn as if entering Zion, i.e., the afterlife, heaven, or a synagogue, temple. In other words, the earth, including its plants, streams, etc., will receive our bodies as if it were a sacred home. Once absorbed into the land, our bodies will go on to sustain others, and the natural cycle will continue. The speaker seems to believe that the afterlife consists precisely of this return to nature. Though it's a less obvious symbol, the water, in lines 22 to 23, the unmourning water of the riding Thames also seems to pick up on these symbolic overtones. The child is buried beside the flowing water of the Thames River, so she, too, has gone back to the earth and its natural cycles. Where this symbol appears in the poem. Lines 7 to 9. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Form. Despite the speaker's refusal to mourn, the poem is still an elegy, a somber, reflective poem about someone who has died. The speaker says that any further elegy of innocence and youth would be akin to blasphemy, an insult to the tragedy of the child's death. And yet, the poem beat's very existence memorializes the girl and somberly reflects on lost youth and innocence. The speaker is trying to have it both ways, and this irony is meant to prove a point. The speaker clearly does mourn the child's death, but is trying to do so in a way that feels meaningful rather than shallow and trite. The poem itself, meanwhile, consists of 4 sestets, or 6-line stanzas. These sestets are written in a loose accentual meter, with a rhyme scheme of ABC. Accentual meter, which is based on the number of stresses, but not the number of syllables, per line, is often found in children's poetry and folk verse. This makes it an apt choice for a poem, albeit a very dark one, about a child. It's a bit looser than accentual syllabic meter, which does factor in the syllable count per line. The style of this poem is also characteristic of Thomas's style in general, which is highly intuitive and willing to bend formal patterns where necessary. His language is intensely rhythmic, almost like a preacher's, but its music is varied and flexible, as if driven by passion more than technical rules. Notice that this poem is flexible with rhyme as well as line length. Most of the poem's rhymes are exact, but a few are imperfect, e.g., darkness, harness. Meter. The poem uses a version of accentual meter, meaning that its line lengths are determined by the number of stressed syllables they contain but not by their overall syllable count, which remains flexible. For example, the first line of each stanza contains 4 strong stresses, even as the overall syllable count varies, as does the placement of stresses. Never until the mankind making. And I must enter again the round. The majesty and burning of the child's death. Opening square bracket ... closing square bracket. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter. Note that it's possible to scan mankind as containing 2 stresses. This is a minor variation on the pattern, however. Typically, the first line of each stanza contains 4 stresses, the second line contains 3, the third contains 4, the fourth contains 4, the fifth contains 2, and the sixth contains 4. Even these rules have some exceptions. For instance, the final line of the final stanza has 5 stresses rather than 4. After the first death, there is no other. The resulting pattern is a mix of consistency and flexibility. The rhythm remains controlled, yet rough and powerful, as if the poet's passion is swelling and pushing against the poem's formal constraints. A bit like the sea tumbling in harness, in line 6. To put it another way, the loose metrical form holds the passion barely in check, just as the speaker barely manages to contain his emotion, the salt seed of tears, etc. Rhyme scheme. Each stanza in the poem follows the rhyme scheme ABC. Making A. Flower B. Darkness C. Breaking A. Hour B. Harness C. Because there are new rhyme sounds introduced in each stanza, one might think of the full rhyme scheme as ABC JKL. The pattern is consistent, but the rhymes themselves vary in terms of their exactness. Most are full rhymes making, breaking, flower, hour, etc., but a few are imperfect darkness, harness, murder, further, friends, Thames. Like the rough accentual meter, these variations add some flexibility and spontaneity to the poem's structure. It's as if the speaker is trying to keep his language tightly controlled due to his supposed refusal to mourn, but is too impassioned to follow some rigid pattern to the letter. A refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London, speaker. The poem is a first-person speaker, an I, who is clearly the poet himself. This poet-speaker, who has learned about a girl's death by fire, self-consciously discusses how he will and will not respond to the tragedy. For example, he will not mourn the girl, at least not in a traditional way, or write a conventional elegy, poetic lament about lost innocence and youth. He won't even cry, "Sow my salt seed," at least until the hour of his own death, when he will re-enter nature and, perhaps, understand what the girl's gone through. Thomas doesn't identify the girl he's referring to, apart from specifying that she lived in London. However, in writing this elegy, he was responding to wartime news. He published the poem toward the end of the Second World War, during which Germany had repeatedly firebombed London and other UK cities. Thomas's own home city of Swansea, Wales had been heavily bombed in 1941. For the poem's original readers, then, the phrase, "death by fire in London," would have immediately evoked this national ordeal. A refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London, setting. The poem's setting is mentioned in its title, London. The city also appears in line 19, deep with the first dead lies London's daughter. Though the poem doesn't spell out the significance of its setting, its context would have been clear to its first readers. A Refusal to Mourn is one of several World War II-era poems Dylan Thomas wrote about Nazi Germany's air raids on the UK. All of these poems appear in his 1946 volume Death and Entrances. Others include Ceremony After a Fire Raid, and among those killed in the Dawn raid was a man aged 100. The most infamous raids, collectively known as the Blitz, occurred in 1940-41. The Nazis also conducted a series of bombings and rocket attacks in 1944-45, closer to the poem's composition date. Together, these raids killed thousands of civilians, with London suffering the heaviest losses. In other words, while death by fire could theoretically refer to any fire, the poem's overall context implies that the child was killed in a firebombing. In memorializing her death, the poet was honoring one of many victims of a national tragedy. Another important setting in the poem is nature or the earth itself. The speaker imagines returning to the water and corn, in other words, to the earth, when their own eventual death comes. Lines 7 to 9. The speaker also vividly describes the young girl's burial site by the Thames River in England, including the worm's long friends, and soil grains, and veins, of her grave. Lines 20 to 23. These haunting details stress the physicality of death and envision it specifically as a return to the environment from which we come. Literary context. The Welsh poet Dylan Thomas (1914–1953) was part of the second generation of modernists. This group of 20th-century writers, which included figures like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, sought new forms of expression, leaving behind the formal conventions of the 19th century to write daring, expansive, psychologically acute poetry in never-before-tried shapes. Thomas was something of a prodigy. He published many of his intense, idiosyncratic poems when he was just a teenager. While his stylistic inventiveness places him among the modernists, his pantheistic feelings about nature and his passionate sincerity also mark him as a descendant of 19th-century Romantic poets like William Blake and John Keats, both of whom he read enthusiastically. He also admired his contemporaries W.B. Yeats and W.H. Auden, who, like him, often wrote of the mystery behind everyday life, though in very different ways. A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London was originally published in London's Horizon magazine in 1945, alongside another famous Dylan Thomas poem, Fernhill. It then appeared in Thomas's acclaimed volume Deaths and Entrances 1946, which also contains such classics as In My Craft or Sullen Art, and Poem in October. This book features 3 other war poems: the title poem, Ceremony After a Fire Raid, and, among those killed in the Dawn raid was a man aged 100. Historical context. Dylan Thomas finished the poem in 1945, the year World War II 1939–1945 came to an end. This bloody, destructive war hit close to home for Thomas. Swansea, his beloved Welsh hometown, was badly damaged by German air raids. Thomas was appalled not only by that great loss but also by the rise of fascism across Europe in the 1930s and 40s. A passionate leftist, he even wrote comical anti-fascist propaganda films for the UK government during the war. Though his poetry usually isn't directly political, his war poems in Deaths and Entrances memorialize some of the victims of Germany's air raids on the UK. The most famous such bombing campaign, known as the Blitz, occurred in 1940–1941 and killed over 40,000 civilians, nearly half of them in London. A baby Blitz followed in 1944, killing around 1,500 civilians. The Nazis also attacked London with pilotless V-1 and V-2 rockets toward the end of the war, resulting in thousands more civilian casualties and additional fire damage. Thomas's wartime elegies, then, sought to process a deadly and traumatic phase in his country's history. More broadly, the apocalyptic imagery of a refusal to mourn, which seems to encompass the tragedy of all mankind, see lines 1 to 6 and 15, reflects the massive upheaval wrought by the deadliest conflict in human history. A Refusal to Mourn the Death, by Fire, of a Child in London, by Dylan Thomas is a 4-stanza poem that is divided into sets of 6 lines, or sestets. The stanzas follow a specific rhyming pattern that remains consistent throughout the entire piece. The lines rhyme, ABC ABC, varying according to the poet's word choices, in all 4 sestets. Never until the mankind making. Bird, beast and flower. Fathering in all humbling darkness. Tells with silence the last light breaking. And the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness. A Refusal to Mourn the Death, by Fire, of a Child in London begins with a very long adjective phrase that modifies the word, darkness, in the 3rd line. To start, the speaker describes the darkness as the source from which mankind is made, and bird, beast and flower are fathered. He sees this darkness, the period before and after life, as having defined who humankind is and what one is able to experience and endure. Additionally, the same can be said for non-human natures as well. The speaker is delving into the origins of life. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn? The sign that he is waiting for will be accompanied by a known fact. When it comes, when nature tells him that the end is here, he will know that he must enter again the water bead from which he came. He also refers to this place as the synagogue of the ear of corn. He will return to the center, origin, and base of all life. He will enter his death, and in doing so once more become a part of the earth. While these beautifully crafted lines tell the reader much about the speaker or poet, they do not elaborate on the title of the poem. The events to which the title refers will not be further described until the 3rd stanza. The next line takes the reader into the climax of this long phrase that started with the 1st line of the poem. The reader now finds out that the emotion that the speaker is refusing to give into is sorrow. He is holding back his desire to mourn until the end of this life. He describes this act as holding back his salt seed from the earth and not allowing the shadow of a sound to escape his mouth. Stanza 3. The majesty and burning of the child's death. I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. In the second half of A Refusal to Mourn the Death, by Fire, of a Child in London, the speaker finally comes to the reason that this narrative is being told, and the reason for which the speaker wants so desperately to mourn, but refuses to. There has been a death in London, a child has died in a fire and he feels great sorrow over the burning of a child's death. The reasoning behind this decision is explained. He does not wish to send this child into death's arms without her grave truth. He does not want to taint the reality of her situation with his own tears and emotions. This would be an act of blasphemy, he believes. He feels the urge to, but will not impact the situation by singing some elegy of innocence and youth. Stanza 4. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. In the final set of 6 lines, the speaker concludes his narrative. He describes how this dead child now lies with London's daughter. It is not clear whether this is a person or a group of people, but considering the speaker's beliefs about death, it is safe to assume this refers to all of London. Thomas was writing during and after the years of World War II, and the poem is most likely speaking of all that was lost during the bombings of London. Amongst all of the loss, the poet has decided to draw attention to the death of one child. All of those lost are now alongside those that were first dead. All of the dead are together in whatever comes after this life. Those that have died have returned to the time before and after life, and their death is nothing special. It is no different from the first death that came at the beginning of time. threw out a refusal to mourn the death, by fire, of a child in London. The speaker, and perhaps Thomas himself, is attempting to come to terms with death and what comes after. Upon seeing the horrors of World War II, it is likely that Thomas was unable to comprehend the full magnitude of what had been lost, and was seeking out an answer of some kind through his writings.